Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world right now. Welcome to our panel discussion on real-world examples of equitable economic development. I am Jasmine Williams Washington, senior analyst at Community Science, and we are excited about our conversation today. I am now going to pass it along to our facilitator today, Amy Misner, Senior Associate with Community Science. Amy?
Thanks, Jasmine. And thank you all for joining us. We're really excited to be in this space together to bring to you the expertise of these amazing practitioners who are working on the ground, focused on building equitable and inclusive growth. In our pre-meetings leading up to the webinar, we all talked about just how much it's needed to have a community of practice and a set of sort of relationships and colleagues that are kind of in the trenches together. And so we hope this feels like one of those conversations, and we invite your collaboration. During our webinar, the time's going to go fast. We just are here till 5. We wanted to start with a quick introduction to equitable economic development, knowing that there really isn't an agreed upon definition of that term, and so wanting to let you know what we mean. And then we'll open it up for a panel discussion. We have a few questions that all the panelists will respond to, and a few that we kind of, just a few people will respond to help us have time to get to answering some of the audience questions. As Jasmine mentioned, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We also got quite a few questions during your registration, which was great. And so we have some of those teed up also. Next slide, Evelyn. Evelyn, can you go to the next slide? Great. So the definition loosely that we are working with for what equitable economic development means is that it really is a system of relationships and strategies that work together to foster conditions for broadly inclusive growth. And as part of that, it's implicit, it's important, it's critical that everyone has equal access to opportunity, and also that any strategies or programs that are implemented, they're designed to compensate for past discrimination. They're designed to reduce barriers and help to create that equal access and opportunity. So as a group, we've reflected on, you can go to the next slide, Evelyn, a framework for getting to equitable and inclusive growth. And this framework comes from a recent article in the Foundation Review, and we're going to put a link to that in the chat. And what we call out is the first cog is really about the system, how the system works, not what we do. What we do is the green cog, but how we do it, who is part of those relationships. And in traditional economic development circles, I think there's general agreement that the key stakeholders are employers, business owners, business leaders, the government and nonprofits that are implementing policies and systems and programs. But what we feel is critical for getting to equitable and inclusive growth is actually another key stakeholder there are the residents, the beneficiaries, those that are sort of the intended recipients of this growth. And so really giving them a seat, not just a seat at the table, but a decision-making seat at the table. And the outer ring talks about kind of some of how that's done, that there truly is not only community and industry partnership, which is, I think everyone kind of agrees is the best practice for economic development, but also community organizing and advocacy and power sharing. And we intentionally invited panelists to this conversation that sit at different points in the economic development system. Some of our panelists are more comfortable in the advocacy and organizing space. Some of them are more comfortable really working within a traditional sort of business environment, and really wanted to create an opportunity for those different perspectives to come together in one space and to think about how they can be mutually supportive and beneficial. The next cog is the strategies, and we've done some extensive kind of literature reviews and interviews about what are the common best practices for equitable and inclusive growth. And there's a lot more consensus in this cog than in the orange cog. In the green cog, pretty much people really, in addition to the fundamental aspects of being connected to the regional economy and building on local business sectors, making sure that there's access to capital, focusing on small business entrepreneurship and expansion and workforce development. There's also the importance in an equitable sense of what is the quality neighborhoods. What is the context for transportation and job accessibility and housing, family financial health. You know, we often hear in this work that people can't progress in their careers, or they can't get to their jobs. They lose their jobs because of childcare, because of car trouble, because of different credit issues. And so thinking about that as a holistic part of the system. And so we have a couple of panelists that will speak today about what gets them really excited in their work about equitable strategies for growth. And the final cog is about results. Why are we doing this work, and measurement, and thinking about how we use data to make our strategies and our systems work better. And in the end, so that all of our citizens have a high quality of life and a sense of well-being. And so we have a couple of panelists that are going to share with you how they use data in their work to lead toward equitable and inclusive growth. And so now, with that introduction, I'd like to introduce our panelists to you and ask them to turn their cameras on. So we have Asata Richards, the founding director of Sankofa Research Institute, Sherry Gonzalez, the director of Casey Rising, Michaela Palmer, the director of organizing and social justice initiatives at the Village of Arts and Humanities, and Spencer Lau, managing associate at Next Street. And I'm going to ask Asata to lead us off and to tell a little bit about her equitable economic development work and how it focuses on furthering equity. And also, Asata, if you can talk to us about how you work to build bridges between the different aspects of the equitable economic development system in which you work.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for making space and time for this important conversation. So I just want to say that I'm approaching this work as a Black feminist, public sociologist, who is a third generation resident of a historic African-American community. So that really informs the work that I do. And I just wanted to talk about three really examples in my work where equity was centered, and how, as Amy said, that I'm attending to working at different levels. So one was the creation of Texas's second community land trust, only the second community land trust in the nation, and scheduled to be the largest in the nation because it was done through a partnership with the city of Houston, right? And the community land trust is important in the context of Houston because we're the only major city that does not have zoning. And we are a major city where property ownership is primary and is center to how all relationships and how markets operate, right? We are a developer created city. And so the Community Land Trust was really created through a partnership with MIT, informed by their work, MIT CoLab, Texas Southern University, using their research around the Community Land Trust model, being able to really do a lot of education and engagement to secure approval and support of the Community Land Trust by the city of Houston, right? And so it's landmark in the fact that the city of Houston became the financial really sponsor of the Community Land Trust, and it's through the subsidy from their housing dollars that the Community Land Trust came into existence. And with that coming into existence, now communities of color, particularly Black and Brown communities, have an opportunity to revitalize their neighborhoods, protect their residents from displacement, and also really challenge the notion and idea that individual ownership is superior and that individual interests, sell, monetize my property can override the needs and the benefits of the community. So now our communities have an opportunity to protect themselves, their history and culture through the Community Land Trust model. The second was the Community Benefits Agreement. Right, so we are scheduled to sign Texas's first community benefits agreement with Rice University or the Rice Management, which is a huge private institution that has billions of dollars in a trust, right, in endowments, right? And so this community benefits agreement, the work of the community benefits agreement came about through dollars from a philanthropic, the Kinder Foundation, community members working together to come up with a policy landscape. And in that policy landscape, tucked away was something called a community benefits agreement, which was signed by the city of Houston and the mayor at the time, right? So again, community-driven solutions, but that really require entities outside the community buy-in and investment in the notion and idea that there are different ways to really manage relationships. And the third piece, so I've talked about the philanthropic community, I've talked about the city, I've talked about universities and institutions, and now the third piece I want to talk about is really the work of building a solidarity economy, right? So we are, through our work with the Democracy Collaborative, going up to visit Cleveland and the Cleveland Foundation, realizing that our residents need and deserve the opportunity for self-determination, right? That all these other decisions about how we fund the housing, where do we get the subsidy, really are the hands of other people. But ultimately, communities should decide for themselves, right? They should have the power and the ability to decide their own fate related to economic realities. And so now we're working to incubate approximately 8 to 10 cooperatively owned, resident-owned, community-owned businesses that, one, provide the services that the resident needs, but two, provides the opportunity and the wealth building that the community needs that is not based on individual wealth building, but collective wealth building, with the understanding that the interdependence that created the community, the culture, the history that created the community are really the building blocks for the neighborhood preserving and protecting itself. So resident-driven, institution-driven, city partnership, philanthropic partnership, realizing, but at the end of the day, who should have power and self-determination are our residents. And so my work attends at all three levels of that system.
I had to get myself off mute. Thank you so much for sharing, for getting us started. Sherry, how about you go next? Same questions.
It's hard to follow, but great energy, great ideas. So I'm Sherry Gonzalez, Director of KC Rising. KC Rising is a regional economic development initiative in the bi-state Kansas City metropolitan area. We're business-led, metrics-driven, and long-term focused. We do define sort of our work as comprehensive economic development, and that includes these two concepts of drivers and enablers. So the drivers are things like traded sectors, the goods and services we sell and then bring dollars in. We also look at innovation and entrepreneurship, small business owners, and then people, right? The rocket fuel that keeps the economy going. The enablers are things like policy and inclusion and place. So in place, we look at transportation and broadband connectivity. Neighborhoods include sort of social determinants of health and housing, among other things. And so through a community engaged effort, one of the things we have been working on since 2019 was articulating a shared vision of regional prosperity. In a sort of pre-question that we got through registration, somebody asked about sustainable development goals, and we actually used some of that concept to create this shared vision. Okay, could we do that for our community? Because it was such a strong aligning effort. It was something that hundreds of countries could get behind, that corporations and nonprofits and individuals all sort of say, we support these goals in these ways. And so that was our inspiration for what we're calling the shared vision in Kansas City. And so each one of these do have, we don't have sort of 17 goals, we have 7 pillars. And those 7 pillars, again, were created with the community. We went to libraries, we went to neighborhood associations, groups that already existed, as well as we had invitations and surveys, and then COVID happened, so Zoom and more Zoom. So we tried very hard to engage with community in creating this. If you're not familiar with Kansas City, we have a very long history of fragmentation going back to the Civil War. And what we are trying to do is create a longer table for civic decision making, looking at system change and how to address those fundamental root causes so that all parts of our community can experience economic mobility and ultimately prosper. And so one example of many things that are going on is that part of our work to support small businesses is that we have been very intentional about the geographic area, communities that have traditionally sort of had divestment, as well as the populations, right? So capital to Black and Brown business owners. When we're talking about capital, we're talking very broadly. There's debt capital, both with banks and alternative lenders. There's what we call intentional inclusive purchasing. And then there's also what we call radical social capital. And this is about really building relationships across things like gender, race, socioeconomic status, and place. So I'm glad to be part of this conversation today. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Sherry. Spencer, how about we have you go next? And again, just to remind the listeners, the questions are about kind of how your work is contributing to economic development, equitable economic development and wealth building, and the ways that you work to build bridges between different aspects of the system.
Sure. Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. My name is Spencer Lau, and I'm a managing associate at NextStreet. NextStreet is a mission-driven firm dedicated to mobilizing capital, customers, and capabilities for small businesses and entrepreneurs that have been systemically held back across the U.S. I come to this work actually growing up in a small business family myself, and an immigrant family myself, as well as, of course, an employee at NextStreet. And so underneath all of that is really a core belief that small business and entrepreneurship is a critical driver for equitable economic development, as it is a way to really enable people to drive their own economic destiny. Our work at NextStreet is really a balance between deep engagement in communities, as well as working at the national and state level to try to redesign systems and structures that have historically created barriers for underserved entrepreneurs and small businesses. And what that meant is really integrating within direct support to small businesses through brick and mortar centers in New York City and in Buffalo, New York, as well as working in what we call local small business ecosystems to really assess and build collective action to help support small business communities across the country. And so underneath all of that is really integration, understanding that in order for equitable small business development to really be in place, that there is a core need to make sure that those specific barriers around accessing capital, accessing networks that really are enabling those small businesses to grow, and then accessing the corresponding services that they need, not only in terms of their own small business, but also their own personal needs as well, is all integrated. And a really good example of this work that we've been doing is done in Cook County, the surrounding county of Chicago, Illinois. So in Cook County, we have been working alongside the Cook County government to stand up the Small Business Assistance Program during COVID. I think that everybody knows at this point that small businesses have been really hit hard because of COVID. COVID-19 has been unrelenting to small businesses, and particularly those owned by people of color, women, and those who have been systemically held back. And so given that, one of the biggest things that we understand about this moment has been that there's been a lot of capital that's been made available through a lot of federal dollars, through grants, but accessing that capital has been a struggle for anybody, but particularly those underserved entrepreneurs. And so what we've been working to do has been really to build a collaborative of both those capital providers who are able to provide that capital with community organizations who have direct connections with place-based communities across Chicago, as well as within all of Cook County, to really be able to support those micro and small businesses owned by people of color and women during COVID to get the financial documents in place to make sure that they have all of the application requirements to really be able to pivot and to get that access to capital accordingly. To note that this is all kind of integrated into our larger thinking, in that in thinking about small business ecosystems more broadly, this collaborative actually is one place where we integrated within our understanding of small business ecosystem through our work in Chicago specifically, where we did an assessment on understanding the core barriers in the state of play for small businesses, particularly those owned by people of color, within the south and west sides of Chicago. And so that integration in terms of that research then integrated into how we thought about that collaborative and trying to make sure that we are addressing those specific needs. Echoing everybody else's excitement for this conversation as well, and thanks, Amy, for inviting us.
Thanks so much, Spencer. Michaela, same questions for you.
Thank you, Amy. So again, my name is Michaela Palmer. I am the Director of Social Justice Initiatives at the Village of Arts and Humanities. We are a 32-year-old neighborhood anchor institution that sits in Philadelphia's Fairhill Hartranct neighborhood, which is in North Philadelphia. For those of you who are familiar with Philly, it's about 10 blocks north of Temple University. We sit in one of the city's most vulnerable communities. This neighborhood has been deeply impacted by racially biased policies, economics, politics. We are in a historically Black neighborhood that has produced a half century of disinvestment that has been designed to break ties between people in place, restrict mobility, restrict knowledge, withhold knowledge, and isolate people from both resources and services. The village is responding urgently to these conditions by very specifically working with community members and cross-sector partners to design and implement multiple community development initiatives that build the capacity of our neighbors to stay in their homes, reduce violence, support returning citizens and formerly incarcerated folks, and build community wealth and ownership. And we frame this at the village as staying power. And to us, staying power is the ability to receive, pass down, and pass on cultural, physical, and relational assets between generations. So what that means is returning to your childhood home and finding it there and thriving. It's building upon wealth from generations before you. It's drawing on wisdom from elders and guardians to write your own narrative of who and where you are. So I'm going to briefly share some very specific, concrete examples of current initiatives that we're working on in the service of equitable economic development. And this is really just a sliver, but for context, the village is adjacent to one of two remaining high-rise projects in the city, and they've been slated to be knocked down next year. When the Philadelphia Housing Authority began reaching out to residents to let them know that they would be removed from their homes and relocated outside of the neighborhood, we pretty quickly were able to organize our residents and citywide stakeholders to make a plan. So we immediately started working with our local community legal services to help residents understand and protect their rights, to set goals with residents in regard to the closing of the apartments. We really center and value trust building among the residents in our organization. So we relied very deeply on our relationships with residents to do on the ground research, to learn how residents were feeling, what they knew, what they wanted to know, and so forth, and also learn from the residents because there was a lot we didn't know as well. We're now connected in the service of kind of building bridge across affinity, and even when there are sometimes maybe competing visions or competing goals, we were able to connect with the Philadelphia Housing Authority to now try and identify ways that we can collaborate specifically around how do we use local vacant homes for development so that residents who do not want to leave the neighborhood have viable options to remain there. So I really want to kind of lift up this word that Asada had used earlier around self-determination, because it really is a central focal point in the work that we do, is how do we work alongside neighbors so that neighbors are making the decisions about what they want so that they're the ones who are benefiting from development in our communities. Our work in the Fairhill apartments that I just mentioned is directly related to a larger initiative that we call 100 Families, which is a vision for 100 families for, 100 homes for 100 families over 100 years using a shared equity model. So we've worked really closely with a group of neighbors that we call leaders and builders to collectively learn about what kinds of equity models exist in the service of enabling neighbors to make decisions that determine what kinds of models work for them and engage the community on the implications for its future vision. So our goal is always for the people in the neighborhood to own and lead that work. There's so many other projects and initiatives that I could really go in depth in, but I just want to lift up a couple of, just quickly, a couple of other things that We're getting ready to open up the development of, or there was a development of a vacant building that we turned into artist studios that will be rented out to Black and other people of color artists at affordable or below market rates. We are also working on the development of Tile Works, which is a workforce development project that will host apprenticeships for neighbors and residents to learn professional tile installation, among many other things. And the goal here is to support residents in developing sustainable skills that can be transferred across industry and also apply directly to the development projects that are happening in our neighborhood. And we are really guided by a set of values that guide our relationships with new developers, including that we ensure that folks who are coming into the neighborhood are wanting to develop in the neighborhood are meeting directly with residents. We are asking and sort of, I don't even want to say asking, it's almost sort of demanding, not that we are able to do that, that folks who are coming into our neighborhood in our corridors and wanting to develop, that they're also making a commitment to hire, train, invest in community members in our neighborhood so that we are practicing not only ensuring that people in the neighborhood that we live in have jobs and sustainable jobs, but they're also learning and building skills that can be transferable beyond just that moment. So these are just a few highlights. So much more is happening, and really incredibly excited to be on here and learning from my fellow panelists as well.
Thank you, Michaela. I'm wondering if it would make sense. I don't know if you just talked about a number of strategies, which are great. I know our next question was going to be, are there specific equitable economic development strategies you're excited about? So it might make sense to see if there's anything else you wanted to add kind of to what you shared, or if you did kind of raise up those strategies already.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say really briefly, I won't keep going on. I think what is most exciting is really building power, right? And as with residents, and as an organization, our main objective is supporting place-based and community-centered solutions to issues that impact our neighborhood. So what is most exciting is working with community members in collaborative, community-based practice in the service of maximizing mobility, eliminating systemic solutions, and really the self-determination that Asada already mentioned, just being at the heart of the work and building the capacity of residents and organizing residents to influence what happens in their neighborhoods, and also be able to put pressure on developers coming into the neighborhood so they're the ones who are determining and defining who comes in the neighborhood and who benefits.
Thank you. Spencer, what about you? You shared a number of examples when you were doing your introduction. Is there more that you'd like to say, or another example about something that you find really exciting about equitable economic development in your work?
Yeah, sure. So I think it ties a little bit into my introduction, but I think it also ties into some of the things that Michaela was speaking to, in that collective action is really something that we have been trying to build within the communities that we've been working in across the country. Really, I think the term specifically ecosystem building around small business development has been a term that's been around, but has certainly had a lot of weight over the last year or so, given COVID, as people have been trying to respond to this moment. Really, in the work that we've been doing across the country, we've been seeing that really as coalitions and multi-stakeholder models have really been coming together to enable both small businesses, residents, communities to all sort of respond to this moment, that there have been really critical conversations about how that ties into entrenched racism and inequities, and how ultimately how we think about the quote unquote new normal, the now a bit cliched term, but really is actually important to try to make it in a way that is moving things forward. And so that is really trying to make sure that ultimately there are better access points for small businesses and entrepreneurs that have historically been restricted from accessing capital networks, all of the various programs that are out there that really build on community assets that are already existing. So I would say that that's really the biggest thing too.
Yeah, I was wondering, just thinking about previous conversations we've had, it might be worth just taking a minute or two, just giving a specific example of a place where, like, how the ecosystem is different, or what you did that sort of is different than the normal.
Sure. So I think the work that we've been working on in Chicago is actually probably a good example. I mentioned this before, but I think that this ties in just in terms of the full through line. So in 2018, we had worked with a variety of stakeholders, both community organizations, bank institutions, philanthropies, et cetera, all to go around the table to say, what is the state of play of small business right now? How do we think about this in terms of what are some of those entrenched barriers for entrepreneurs of color, women entrepreneurs, et cetera, to really ensure that we are creating community-informed strategies to address those barriers. What ultimately that has led to is that there's been a coalition built in Chicago called the Chicago Inclusive Growth Coalition that has been working specifically on trying to drive this community-driven strategies and in pushing and thinking about how do you expand access to capital, how do you push policies within city governments to really make it so that it's a more inclusive small business environment for folks. Where we've seen this actually become realized was that Cook County program that I was talking about before, in that really because that collaborative has been put in place in response to this moment right now, the next steps really were how do you essentially leverage this network of community organizations who are doing really great work in place to ensure that those folks are getting the appropriate resources to not only build their own capacity, but also to then eventually funnel the resources to small businesses who may not have historically even heard of some of the integration across this full ecosystem of stakeholders within that particular place. And so that has been fairly different, I think, than what we've seen historically in small business development more broadly, in that, thinking about how you build on community assets in a way that is integrated, that really has the direct relationships in communities. It's been something that we've seen really build out in Chicago, and we've been seeing build outs across all of the communities that we've been working in across the country. And just to answer the question in the chat, it's the Chicago Inclusive Growth Coalition.
Thank you. So one of the things that is kind of rumbling around in my mind that I'd love to ask a question about, but I want to let Asata and Sherry speak about their data slides first, and then maybe if we have time, is just if you start your work from the unit of analysis, as an evaluator, the unit of analysis or the unit of thinking of the regional economy or the local economy, or if you start your thinking from the neighborhood, how does that affect? It's like, that's what I'm hearing as you're speaking, is there's this, it's where do you start into the conversation, and then how does that affect where you go and how you're able to collaborate? And so it might be something we can explore in the question and answer time, because I think that's sort of a unique aspect of each of your sort of entry into this work. But before we do that, Asata, how about we have you speak about the data points that you have found transformational in your work toward equity?
And as those come up, I also want to say, Amy, just to say that if we start off with the definition that this issue exists at all levels, then I think we have a responsibility wherever we work to be asking ourselves, who is working at the other levels, right? So if we're working at the regional level, we should be looking for partners or supporting the capacity building at the city level, right? And if we're working at the city, then we should be thinking about the neighborhood level. So I just want to say that's our responsibility. So I want to thank you for, just an opportunity to talk more about the neighborhood, which I'm a third generation resident of, right? And where my work is really based in terms of equity. And this is the historic Third Ward. And for those of you who may not know, this is the home of George Floyd. This is the neighborhood where George Floyd came from. This is also the home of Beyonce and Debbie Allen and Felicia Rashad Allen, right? So this is a historic neighborhood. Lightning Hopkins, John Biggers, the acclaimed artist, and also the picture of the Negro Hospital. So this is a neighborhood that sits, the first public park sits in the historic Third Ward in the state of Texas, right? By people of African descent, called Emancipation Park. But we know now from history and the years of redlining and systemic racism and what we know as white supremacy, that this is a neighborhood that has been really dying on a vine and in this neighborhood, the context of this neighborhood, African-American, medium household income under, why did George Floyd end up in Minneapolis, right? Because of these conditions where he couldn't find the opportunities he needed. 20% unemployment rate, predominantly renters, and really struggling economically. Next slide, please. And so even when you look at the conditions of this neighborhood, you see the stress that the residents are under, right? In the physical live conditions, right? Where they're worried about, being able to live in the neighborhood, where they're worried about if they can afford housing, right? And this is pre-COVID, right? And they're vulnerable in a neighborhood where development is happening. And then in their personal lived experience, 43% of the residents have pets. This is a door-to-door study, right? 23% have mold, no heat or AC, 7% have no running water. So we're talking about really challenging conditions. And this is pre-COVID, right? So we understood that our residents were under a lot of stress. We understood that the conditions were challenging, but this validated it. Next slide. But this is the moment for me. This is the moment, right? Despite all of these conditions in this neighborhood, 80% of these residents say they are satisfied living in Third Ward, right? So what they're satisfied with isn't in the amenities of the neighborhood. It's not even in the conditions of their home, but there is something about this neighborhood that they see so valuable that despite what they're going through, they want to stay in this neighborhood, right? And then despite under those conditions, I can't tell you that I would vote in a presidential election, which doesn't seem to be making a difference in my life, right? But still, these residents are civically engaged. But the most important thing that I think was very transformational, not only to me, but to my team, was the level of collective efficacy. This notion and this idea. And when we asked residents this question, this wasn't, will you check on an elderly neighbor? Will you give a neighbor a ride? Would you watch a neighbor's kid? This was, do you think that there is someone else in this neighborhood, your neighbor, that would do this thing, right? It wasn't even asking them, what did they think about themselves? It was, what did they think about one another? And so that was transformational to me, because when you think about what are the most valuable assets in the community, the first thing you talk about is, we've got to secure the land, we got to secure the property, we got to get some investment in here. When we saw this data, we understood the greatest assets in our neighborhood was our residents, who despite all of their circumstances, cultivated a sense of compassion, empathy, care and concern for one another, which is the reason why they have been able to survive the conditions that many other people could not survive, with a sense of dignity, care, and concern for the neighborhood. And so I didn't get asked this question, but this is what I'm excited about, right? And this is why now I see Dominic Moulton from DC on the line, that's helping us really be able to say, how do we leverage the greatest assets of our community, which is our residents? And for us, what we're excited about is building businesses that these residents own and operate. And I'm excited because as a person of African descent, a grandmother who picked cotton from the 4th grade, who cleaned houses for white people in rich parts of town, rode buses 2 and 3 hours, the fact that now at this stage in my life, that I can create businesses that her children and her children's children's children can own and operate, that we can control our labor. And I think that the greatest injustice is that people of African descent who were brought here for their labor, who was exploited for their labor, now have no control of their economic realities. That's the greatest crime. And so I'm excited about creating a model that will allow people of African descent to finally own the one thing that brought them to this nation, which is their labor, and use that labor in a way that builds for themselves the wealth and the resources that they can build and share with their children, but most importantly, share with the community that is really the social safety net that has protected us and kept us together. And as I close, you know, we know what happened under COVID, right? When the stores began to close and America shut down and the world shut down, no one came for Black and brown people, right? No one sent any rescue ships, right? No one said, let us leave some toilet paper on the aisle, let us leave some water on the shelf. Nobody came, right? And when death came knocking at the door, we were all on our own. And if we're all on our own, then what we've got to say is that the people who are willing to look out for the least among us, the least and the last and the forgotten, should be in a position to save as many as they can. And we know that that's not the wealthy, that's not the institutional leaders, that's not the business owners, because we know what they did when they had an opportunity, right? So we've got to invest in the people who have the compassion and the capacity to create a social safety net for other people and not just for themselves. And so that's what I'm excited about, is changing the paradigm of equity to say the least and the last among us should be the first that we invested and the most that we invested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asata. I think seeing the chat, there's a overwhelming support, and just appreciate your spirit that you bring to us today. Sherry, again for you, a different but related question about you know, how have you, I guess is a better way to say it, how have you decided what data to prioritize in your work?
Yeah, so I'll share this because we do it through different means. You know, you've talked about the regional, and then we also try to get to the neighborhood. We're trying to connect those. And before I do that, though, I saw some of it in the chat, but like, amen to Asata, right? Like in her message. I mentioned a little bit about what KC Rising is, but we are this fluffy thing we call a shared vision for regional prosperity for all. And how do we do that? You know, with alignment, and we believe that alignment will help bring acceleration to community efforts for greatest impact. So it isn't about the deeds we're doing, it's the deeds that are happening elsewhere. And our job is to amplify, celebrate, and where necessary, sort of resource that. And so if you'll go to the next slide, this is what we call our operative model. It is just a structure of how we get the work done. We are not an organization. We're supported by the 4 organizations that are listed on the bottom that are civic regional organizations. 3 are business-led. 1 is led by elected officials, a public entity. And in this model, there are hundreds of volunteers, leaders, and so those individuals come from what we call the public square. So yes, it's business, but it also includes government and philanthropy and community organizations, and education institutions, because we really do believe it takes all of us to see the change we want to in our community. If you go to the next slide, this is just, so the question that you're sort of asking me is about the, I believe, like, how did we decide and how did we prioritize? And so we did have to have somebody who's responsible for doing the work, right? Like, so if we get ideas about what data we want, who's going to actually make sure that we get the data points, that they're updated regularly, they're put into some kind of cohesive structure, right? And so this group, the data and analysis resource team, are what we would consider sort of experts doing this work in the community, but they're really there as a resource, right, for what we gather from the community. So if you go to the next slide, this is what we call our metrics framework. So at the top level, those horizon goals, those are the ones that, you know, are the more regional measures. And why are they regional? Because we're trying to contextualize our economic growth in comparison to other metros. And That's the measure you can get in that comparison is metro level data, and it's usually time lagged and it's not great, but it gives you that comparison of how are we doing. Now we have two categories. We're looking at growing the economy for everyone. We don't say one is more important. They both have equal weight in our sort of framework. And then you sort of go down in tiers and it gets closer to the neighborhood level. So pillar metrics go back to those 7 pillars, similar to the Sustainable Development Goals. Those each have an icon, a description, and then a measure. And then strategy level metrics get to sort of at the neighborhood level, what are we doing about it? So if you go to the next slide, you would see what are our horizon goals. So we're looking at things like net migration and productivity, or the percent of workers that are in self-sufficient households. That looks at, can you pay your housing, your transportation, your healthcare, and if necessary, your childcare, and then the black-white wealth gap. And so these are those higher level metrics. There's economic theory built into this where we know that over the last 20 years, we've seen great productivity in the economy and we're not seeing the wages get to the people, right? And so that is a disparity. And so we sort of built some of that into the model. Next slide. Keep going. And so these are the 7 pillars. We're looking at entrepreneurship, neighborhoods, inclusion, industry, which is where we're playing to our strengths. Culture is sort of arts and sports and food that make a community a nice place to live. Connectivity includes transportation and broadband, and then education is across the continuum for all learners, not just sort of K through 12. And so then we do double click, go ahead and go to the next slide. And I mentioned that each pillar has sort of different elements to it. So this is an example of the inclusion pillar where you see what we call the badge, so the visual representation. The bolded statement is our pillar statement. You could put a because in front of it. This matters to the economy because economies thrive through increased participation where everyone has equitable opportunity to advance. And then there's a longer description, which is sort of our end state, what we would hope to see in our community, right? So true inclusion means investing in potential everywhere it lives, in every classroom, every zip code, and every business plan. So the question is about metrics and how do we decide? So if you go to the next slide, that data team sort of looked at the words and said, okay, how might we measure progress toward this in the grow the economy for everyone categories that we have throughout our metrics framework? And then we took those ideas out into the community and we asked, does this make any sense at all, right? And so why did we start with that? Well, one, because some of the people of the community were on the committee. And but we felt like we would get a better response having something for them to critique. This was not by any means sort of saying, this is what we're going to do, will you bless it? And you can see some of the feedback that we received that is on the other side there. Like this was sort of documenting the feedback. The community said to us, when you're talking about inclusion and economy, like really we need to talk about power dynamics. Can we actually have an indicator that speaks directly to social exclusion that's firmly rooted in power structures here in Kansas City? Some other suggestions were things like, an appreciation of, they appreciated that we were looking at some of the labor force participation because that can be disaggregated and really get to who's being left out. There was an acknowledgement of asset building and policies versus incomes, but and things around mortality rates and the poverty tax. One of the things that was interesting is that they were saying to us, it's not enough to just sort of say that somebody's participating, but how do we know that they're really able to be a decision maker? And it caused that group that I showed you to sort of go back and think deeply of how do we measure power dynamics in a community, that decision-making table. Is it possible to measure that? We have, in addition to these categories at the pillar metric level, it's a spatial metric, right? And so I mentioned at the beginning the history of Kansas City and the deep segregation that exists here. And so the spatial metric helps to sort of also give one more dimension of for who is this benefiting, right? And all of those three categories of grow the economy for everyone spatially is in every one of these. And so some of the measures that were shown earlier by Asata, we're looking at that as well. So how are we using it? Is that we are asking, we are creating actually a dashboard that isn't just sort of static, but it is geospatially there, and you can actually click different layers and sort of see how do these interplay, right? And across the 7 pillars, not just within these metrics. And what we're starting to do is to ask organizations to use that level of data in their decision making, whether it be a local government, a nonprofit, a philanthropy, because we do think that it is important to be able to make explicit, data does tell a story, explicit some of this disparity. We all feel it, we know it exists, but sometimes some people need to be able to see it and they feel like it needs to be proven in fact. And we're trying to do that for those that need this to change their decision making, and inclusion is integrated and equity into every one of these pillars. So that is, that's some of how we are using data and trying to prioritize that.
Thank you, Sherry. And I know we should have said at the start, but or maybe we did, that we will be sharing the slide deck so people will have these slides. But is it also, are your various metrics available on your website?
The
or
full
not yet?
slate of them, not yet, just the
Okay.
Horizon Goals ones.
Okay.
Very soon they will be.
Okay, okay, great. So if you are a data nerd and would like to really dig in, I think Sherry, you'd be willing to share that information. Yeah. Okay, great. So we have about 7 minutes, and we've prioritized a few questions, but I would also invite, if you have questions, to go ahead and put them in the chat. And I also, I'm not sure I remember to say this at the beginning, but I want to encourage you, we do have everybody's email addresses at the end of the slide deck. And so, you know, if we don't get to your question, but you have a particular question for us that you think a specific speaker or multiple speakers would be able to answer, I encourage you to send it out. And of course, respecting how busy these amazing practitioners are, but I know everybody sort of wants to be supportive in community. So I think I'll start, Asasi, with you and the question that we got about, you know, how does the things we've talked about, how does it play out in rural areas? And is there anything particularly around a rural context that you would raise up that people need to consider, or that might be different than kind of the themes we've talked about already?
I actually think that because I have a strong connections with rural place settings, that I think that there are some strong, really values that exist in rural places because of the really interdependence model, right? And I think for me, it's really about, you know, seeing what those assets of community are and building on those assets of communities, right? How do we give rural places the really resources and the building blocks to, again, be self-determining, to make sure that they have access to transportation, and many rural places access to technology, and many rural places access to water, right? I come from rural Texas, right? And those are some key things. And so our communities were able to really, really work together around faith-based institutions. Churches were really important, right? Working with churches to share those resources, those common spaces, put hotspots for technology there, give residents access to those church places, even bringing in postal services, right? Because those became limited. And so I think the context context is being able to really build upon the building blocks in a community. And I think the rural building blocks are very strong because people are practicing interdependence in very strong ways and seeing those as the cultural components in which you build upon. And I think also the cooperative business model with the aging population, right? The need for really care and even childcare. There are so many needs that people in rural places have that I still think the ideal of cooperative economics is the answer to when the market fails us. And what is happening, just like in urban African-American Latino neighborhoods, is that the market is failing us, right? So how do we solve the market failure issue? And I think that's the work there.
Thank you. Spencer, could you speak briefly to a question we got about how equitable investment can be achieved in small market, low growth cities? Kind of moving up the spectrum.
Yeah. So I actually think that it's fairly similar actually to what Asada was speaking to, and that it's thinking about place-based investment specifically and thinking about how do you build on community assets that are already existing. I think that the idea in terms of the smaller markets and lower growth cities is that there is entrenched history in terms of why that slow growth has sort of been in place. But also there are a lot of really significant efforts that are already happening. And so being really intentional in terms of that place-based investment strategy is probably first and foremost. I'd say that the combination of that with, while you're making those investments, also trying to expand more information in terms of what is happening on the ground, and making investments into both sort of that community building, but also the corresponding research and impact measurements that I think that we all sort of know is important to eventually galvanize more investment into a particular place. And so that combination of making direct investments already in terms of initiatives that we know are emerging and have already been in place, with that expansion of resources to really ensure that communities are built around a particular community development priority, and really focusing around equitable economic development is probably the greatest combination of things to really build out from there.
Thank you. So this will be our last question, and I know we're getting close to time, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it and let Sherry and Michaela answer it. And if you need to leave, then we understand, folks, but I think it's an important question to get their perspectives on. So the question was, not all players in ecosystems are open to changing practices that incorporate equity. How can practitioners identify those who are willing? And I think implicit in that is, what do you do when people are not willing? And so maybe, Michaela, why don't you start?
Sure. So I think for us at the Village, we really rely on community organizing to bring folks together and put pressure on folks and developers who are coming into the neighborhood, to make sure that they're really leading the charge and being able to make decisions about what comes into their neighborhood and what does not come into their neighborhood. So, that kind of work is sometimes untraditional, I think, in some of the spaces that folks on this call might occupy, but having a base of people and a group of people who you are working with who are committed to this work, who have the capacity to understand the players and the actors and what community economic development means, allows for us to put pressure on developers as they're coming in, to influence them. As I said, I know I'm being redundant, to influence them as they're coming in, to galvanize folks across community, across neighborhood, and build a base of multiple people who are well-versed, well-knowledged on the issue, who can then speak to the developers who are coming in. And we've seen that happen time and time again, where someone will come in and they'll want to do something within the neighborhood, and we've been able to galvanize neighbors who are connected to the issue, who can then essentially say, no, this isn't what we want. And it's that people power, right, is a very difficult thing for developers to get past. So we really rely on organizing to make that happen.
And something you said that I've sort of observed in your work is sort of that figure, like you said, that having that expertise of how the system works and knowing how to put pressure strategically. is, I think, something that people that aren't familiar with organizing don't fully understand. That it's not just getting people together and arguing and sort of or yelling, but it's actually sort of figuring out how to strategically put that pressure to get what you need, and you get to do that so skillfully. Sherry, what about you? What would you add?
So I mentioned in my remarks that Casey Rising isn't an organization. So inherent in that is that we have no sort of reason for people to be there other than that they're willing, right? We are a coalition of willing, brokering, and trust. And we made this shift a few years ago to integrate inclusion in everything that we do and became very explicit about equity. And not everyone who was at our table at the time agreed with the change. And when they verbalized that they weren't in agreement, my leadership thankfully said, thank you very much for your service, and like essentially bye-bye, right? And it was a commitment to this conviction, not just that this is the right thing to do because it is the right thing to do, but because there's actually an economic imperative here. It makes sense economically, and we need to do it for the betterment of all parts of our community and residents. And so I appreciate that. And so now inherent in what we do is that you don't get to be a leader in Casey Rising unless you have gone through training with Racial Equity Institute around implicit bias and structural racism. We require that of all of our leaders, and then we make it available to all of our volunteers. And it is a framework in which we do our work. And that has sort of weeded people out who don't necessarily agree with it. I wanted to very quickly, somebody asked about COVID dollars. In all the unprecedented things that we are seeing in this time, we are seeing unprecedented amounts of federal dollars. The concern is that we are going to see what we saw with PPP, and it's not going to get to where it's needed most. And so we have been organizing in Kansas City to try to be as intentional as possible and ahead of the curve about how allocations might be made, advocating for inclusive economic growth. And so I would say, if you're not already, get involved in how those dollars are going to be allocated in your communities at state, county, local level.
Thank you so much. Jasmine, do you want to come on and help wrap us up?
Yes. So I want to, well, we all would like to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time out today to talk with us about your experiences. And I just want to remind everyone that a recording and the slides will be available. We will follow up with you via email. In addition to that email, if you lose the email, we will also make these resources available on our website at www.communityscience.com. And for those of you who would love to get in touch with our esteemed panelists, they are awesome. We saw all the kudos to them and appreciations to them in the chat. These are their email addresses, their contact information, along with our facilitator, Amy. And until next time, friends, please be on the lookout for our next panel discussion, and we will see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.